The courtroom smelled of old wood and cold air conditioning. Elena Marchetti sat with her hands folded on the table in front of her, her fingers pressing against each other so hard that her knuckles had turned white. She could feel every pair of eyes in the room burning into the back of her skull, and she knew exactly what they were thinking. Poor woman. Foolish woman. A woman who had made the greatest mistake of her life. Her lawyer, a nervous man named Patterson, who kept adjusting his tie, leaned toward her and whispered something about staying calm. She did not hear the words. Her ears were filled with the sound of her own heartbeat, loud and relentless, like a drum announcing her execution. Across the aisle, seated at the opposing table, was the man she had married 3 years ago in a ceremony that had cost more than most people earned in a decade. Dante Romano. His dark suit fit him like it had been sewn directly onto his body. His jaw was set in that familiar way, the way that told everyone in the room that he was in complete control. His storm-gray eyes were fixed on the judge, but Elena knew he was aware of her every movement, every breath, every tremble of her hands. The whispers behind her grew louder. She caught fragments of sentences, pieces of gossip that cut deeper than any blade. She must be insane, one voice said. Divorcing him? Does she have a death wish? Another voice, lower and more amused. He will destroy her. The Romanos do not let go of what belongs to them. Elena closed her eyes for a moment and remembered the first time she had seen Dante. It had been at her father's funeral of all places. She had been standing by the casket, her black dress too tight around her chest, her eyes swollen from days of crying. Her father had been a good man, a hard-working man, a man who had built a small construction company from nothing and had died believing he had secured his daughter's future. He had been wrong. The debts had appeared like ghosts, after his death, loans she had never known about. Promises made to men whose names were spoken only in whispers. Her father had borrowed from the wrong people, and those people had come to collect. Dante had appeared at the funeral like a shadow taking human form. He had offered her his handkerchief without a word, and when she had looked up into his face, she had seen something that terrified her and fascinated her in equal measure. Power. Complete and absolute power. He had paid off her father's debts that same week. He had saved her mother's house. He had made every problem disappear with a wave of his hand and a few phone calls. And in return, he had asked for only one thing. Her. The marriage had not been a proposal. It had been a transaction. Eleanor had understood that from the beginning. She had walked down the aisle with a smile painted on her face and fear coiled in her stomach like a serpent waiting to strike. She had become Mrs. Romano, the wife of a man whose name made. Powerful people go pale. But 3 years had passed and something had changed. Something inside her had shifted, grown, transformed. She was no longer the terrified girl who had traded herself for her family's survival. She was a woman who had learned to see through the walls that Dante built around himself. She was a woman who had discovered that the monster everyone feared was also a man who stayed awake at night, watching over her while she slept. A man who had once carried her for 3 miles through a snowstorm when her car broke down on a mountain road. A man who kept a photograph of her laughing in his wallet, hidden where no one else could see it. And she was a woman who had made a decision that would shock everyone in this courtroom, including Dante himself. The judge cleared his throat and the whispers died instantly. Judge Morrison was a stern man with silver hair and eyes that had seen too many lies. He looked down at the documents in front of him, then at Eleanor, then at Dante. "Your petition for divorce has been filed, Mrs. Romano," he said. His voice echoed in the high-ceilinged room. "Before we proceed, I must ask if you understand the implications of this action." Elena stood. Her legs felt unsteady, but she forced herself to remain upright. Her voice, when it came, was clear and strong. "I understand, Your Honor." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. She heard someone gasp. She felt the weight of Dante's gaze shift toward her, and for a moment she allowed herself to meet his eyes. What she saw there made her heart clench. He was not angry. He was not cold. He was hurt. Dante Romano, the man who had built an empire on fear and respect, the man whose enemies disappeared without a trace, the man who had never shown weakness to anyone, was looking at her with pain written across his features. The judge continued speaking, but Elena barely heard him. She was lost in the memory of the night before, when she had finally told Dante what she was going to do. They had been in the library of their estate, a room filled with leather-bound books and the smell of aged whiskey. Dante had been standing by the window, looking out at the gardens that stretched toward the distant lights of the city. His reflection in the glass had been ghostly, translucent, like a man already fading from the world. "I am filing for divorce tomorrow," she had said. He had not moved. He had not even blinked. "Is there someone else?" he had asked, his voice flat and controlled. "No, there is no one else. There never has been." "Then why?" She had taken a deep breath, feeling the words rise in her chest like a wave preparing to crash against the shore. "Because I love you," she had said, "and I cannot watch you destroy yourself anymore." He had turned then, and she had seen the confusion in his eyes, the great Dante Romano, a man who understood everything, who controlled everything, who anticipated every move before it was made, was completely lost. "I do not understand," he had said. Elena had crossed the room and taken his hands in hers. They were warm and rough, the hands of a man who had built his empire with his own strength. "You have spent your entire life fighting," she had said, "fighting your enemies, fighting your family, fighting yourself. And I have watched you win every battle, but I have also watched you lose something precious with every victory. You are losing yourself, Dante. You are becoming the monster that everyone believes you to be." "I am what I am," he had replied. "I cannot change what I am. You can. I have seen who you truly are. I have seen the man behind the mask. And that man is not a monster. That man is kind. That man is gentle. That man deserves to be free." She had released his hands and stepped back. "Tomorrow I will file for divorce, and when the courtroom is full of your enemies and your allies and everyone who has ever whispered about the great Dante Romano, I will do something that no one expects. I will set you free from this prison you have built around yourself." He had stared at her for a long moment, and then, for the first time since she had known him, she had seen tears gather in his eyes. "Elena," he had whispered, "you do not know what you are asking. I know exactly what I am asking. I am asking you to trust me." Now, standing in the courtroom with the judge's voice droning in the background, Elena prepared to keep her promise. She had planned every detail of this moment, rehearsed every word, anticipated every reaction. But nothing could have prepared her for the weight of it, the reality of standing before the world and doing the unthinkable. The judge finished reading the preliminary statements and looked at Elena expectantly. "Mrs. Romano, you have filed this petition under the claim of irreconcilable differences. However, before we proceed with the formal hearing, I must ask if there is anything you wish to say to the court." Elena nodded. She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper, her hands trembling slightly as she unfolded it. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady despite the chaos in her heart, "I filed for this divorce because I believe it is the only way to reveal the truth about my husband, the truth that everyone in this room deserves to know." She heard the collective intake of breath from the gallery. She saw Dante's lawyer lean forward, ready to object, but Dante himself raised a hand, stopping his lawyer without a word. "Let her speak," Dante said. His voice was calm, resigned, as if he had already accepted whatever fate awaited him. Elena unfolded the paper completely and began to read. "3 years ago, I married Dante Romano because I had no choice. My family was drowning in debt and he offered to save us. I believed I was trading my freedom for my mother's security. I believed I was marrying a criminal, a man of violence, a man to be feared." She paused, letting the words sink into the silence. "I was wrong." The whispers started again, confused and curious. "For 3 years I have lived in Dante Romano's home. I have eaten at his table. I have slept in his bed. I have watched him when he thought no one was looking. And I have discovered something that would shock everyone in this room." She turned to face the gallery, her eyes sweeping across the faces of the curious, the skeptical, the hostile. Dante Romano is not the monster you believe him to be. The murmurs grew louder. Someone laughed, a harsh and disbelieving sound. Eleanor ignored them all. In the past 3 years, my husband has quietly donated more than $15 million to children's hospitals across this country. He has paid for the education of over 200 underprivileged students. He has funded shelters for families facing hardship and clinics for communities without access to health care. He has done all of this anonymously, without seeking recognition or praise, because he believes that true generosity does not need an audience. She held up the paper. I have the records here. Every donation, every scholarship, every dollar that went to help people who will never know his name. This is the man I married. This is the man the world calls a monster. The courtroom erupted. Voices clashed against each other. Questions shouted across the room. Cameras flashing from the press section despite the judge's orders. Judge Morrison banged his gavel repeatedly, demanding order. It took several minutes for the chaos to subside. Mrs. Romano, the judge said, his voice strained, this is highly irregular. You are here to dissolve your marriage, not to make public statements about your husband's character. Eleanor nodded. I understand, Your Honor, and I am making these statements because they are relevant to my petition. She turned to look at Dante, who sat motionless at his table. His face was unreadable, a mask that revealed nothing. But his eyes, those storm-grey eyes that had haunted her dreams for 3 years, were fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. I filed for divorce, she said, speaking directly to him now, because I wanted the world to see who you really are. I wanted everyone in this room to understand that the man they fear, the man they gossip about, the man they judge without knowing, is also a man capable of extraordinary kindness. She took a step toward him. But I also filed for divorce because I realized something important. I realized that I do not want to be married to Dante Romano, the legend. I do not want to be the wife of a man who hides behind a mask of power and fear. Her voice softened. I want to be married to the real you, the man who makes terrible coffee but insists on bringing it to me every morning, the man who reads poetry when he thinks no one is watching, the man who held my hand through my mother's surgery and never left the hospital for 48 hours. She reached out and touched his face, her fingers gentle against his cheek. So, this is not goodbye, Dante. This is a new beginning. I am asking you to let go of the mask. I am asking you to step into the light. I am asking you to be the man I fell in love with, not in secret, but openly, for the whole world to see. The courtroom was utterly silent. Even the judge seemed frozen, his gavel suspended in mid-air. Dante rose slowly from his seat. He stood before her, tall and imposing, a man who had commanded empires and crushed enemies. But in that moment, he was none of those things. He was simply a man looking at the woman he loved. You planned this, he said quietly. All of it. Eleanor smiled. I learned from the best. For a long moment, he did not move. Then, slowly, the mask began to crack. His lips curved into a smile, rare and genuine, a smile that transformed his face from something fearsome into something beautiful. You are the most infuriating woman I have ever known, he said, and you love me for it. I do. God help me, I do. He pulled her into his arms, right, there in the middle of the courtroom, and kissed her with a passion that made the gallery gasp. When he finally released her, his eyes were bright with an emotion that few people had ever seen. Elena turned back to the judge, who was staring at them with an expression of complete bewilderment. Your Honor, she said, I would like to withdraw my petition for divorce. The judge blinked several times. You want to withdraw? Yes. I believe my husband and I have some things to work out. But we will be working them out together. Judge Morrison let out a long breath and shook his head. In 30 years on this bench, I have never seen anything like this. He looked at the gallery, at the confused faces and the frantic journalists, and then back at Elena and Dante. Petition withdrawn. This court is adjourned. As Elena and Dante walked out of the courtroom hand in hand, the whispers followed them. But they were different now. They were no longer whispers of fear and judgment. They were whispers of wonder and curiosity, and for the first time in 3 years, Eleanor felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. If you are not, hit that subscribe button right now, because you do not want to miss what happens next in this story. Trust me, the best is yet to come. The drive from the courthouse to the Romano estate took 45 minutes, but to Elena, it felt like a journey through time itself. She sat in the back of the armored sedan, her hand still intertwined with Dante's, and watched the city transform outside the tinted windows. The glass towers of downtown gave way to tree-lined avenues, then to the rolling hills that surrounded their home. Neither of them had spoken since leaving the courthouse. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was full, heavy with words that did not need to be said, with emotions that had been building for years. Finally, as the car turned onto the private road that led to the estate, Dante broke the silence. "You should have told me what you were planning." Elena turned to look at him. His profile was sharp against the window, his jaw set in that familiar way. But there was something different in his posture, something looser, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "If I had told you," she said, "you would have stopped me." He considered this for a moment. Probably. Definitely. A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "You know me too well. I know you well enough." The car passed through the iron gates of the estate and wound its way up the long driveway. The house appeared before them, a sprawling structure of stone and glass that had been in the Romano family for 3 generations. It was beautiful and imposing, a fortress disguised as a home. When the car stopped, Dante's men were already waiting. They stood in their usual positions, alert and watchful, but Elena noticed something different in their expressions as she and Dante emerged from the vehicle. There was a new respect in their eyes, mixed with something that might have been hope. Marco, Dante's second-in-command, approached them with measured steps. His face was carefully neutral, but Elena could see the questions burning behind his eyes. "Everything has been secured," he said to Dante. "The press is being managed. The family is asking for a statement." "Tell them to wait," Dante replied. "We have other matters to attend to first." Marco nodded and stepped back, but his gaze lingered on Elena for a moment longer than usual. She met his eyes steadily, and something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement, a recognition of what she had done. Inside the house, Elena led Dante through the familiar halls, past the portraits of his ancestors, and the expensive artwork that decorated every wall. She did not stop until they reached the library, the room where their conversation had begun the night before. The afternoon light poured through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the Persian carpet. Elena crossed to the sideboard and poured 2 glasses of whiskey, handing one to Dante without a word. He took it, studying the amber liquid for a moment before speaking. "You took an enormous risk today," he said. "Everything I have built, everything my family has protected for generations, you exposed it to the world." Eleanor sipped her whiskey, feeling the warmth spread through her chest. "I exposed your kindness," she said, "your generosity, your humanity. I showed the world that there is more to Dante Romano than the stories and the legends. And what if they do not believe it? What if they see it as a trick, a manipulation? Then they are fools, but I do not think they are. I think the world is tired of monsters. I think people want to believe that redemption is possible, that even the darkest souls can find their way to the light." Dante set down his glass and walked to the window. His reflection stared back at him, ghostly and translucent, superimposed over the gardens and the distant hills. "When I was a boy," he said slowly, "my father told me that power is the only thing that matters. He said that kindness is weakness, that compassion is a trap, that love is a weapon to be used against you. He taught me to build walls around my heart, to trust no one, to expect betrayal from every direction." He turned to face her. "I believed him for a long time. I built my empire on those principles. I crushed my enemies without mercy. I made decisions that still haunt me in the dark hours of the night." Elena set down her own glass and crossed to him. She took his hands in hers, feeling the familiar warmth and roughness of his skin. "And then?" she asked softly. "And then I met you." His voice broke on the last word, and Elena felt tears prick at her eyes. "You walked into my life like a storm I never saw coming," he continued. "You challenged me, defied me, stood up to me when everyone else was too afraid to speak. You showed me that the walls I had built were not protecting me, they were imprisoning me." He lifted her hands to his lips and kissed them gently. "You saved me, Elena. Not with grand gestures or dramatic confrontations. You saved me with breakfast conversations and quiet evenings. You saved me with your patience and your stubbornness and your absolute refusal to see me as the monster everyone believes me to be." Elena reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the strong line of his jaw. "You are not a monster," she said. "You never were. You were just a man who had been taught to believe he had to be one." He pulled her into his arms, holding her close. She could feel his heartbeat against her cheek, steady and strong, the heartbeat of a man who had finally found his way home. They stood like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's embrace, as the afternoon light slowly faded into evening. "What happens now?" Elena finally asked. Dante released her and walked back to the window. The gardens were bathed in the golden light of sunset, and in the distance she could see the lights of the city beginning to flicker to life. "Now," he said, "we begin again." He turned to face her, and there was a new determination in his eyes. "For too long, I have hidden behind the mask my father created for me. I have let fear and reputation define who I am. But you have shown me that there is another way, a better way." He crossed back to her and took her hands again. "I am going to change, Elena. Not just for you, but for myself. I am going to step out of the shadows and show the world who I really am. I am going to use the power I have built to do something meaningful, something lasting." Elena smiled, tears streaming down her face. "I know you will," she said. "I have always known." He kissed her then, a kiss that was different from all the others they had shared. It was not a kiss of passion or desperation. It was a kiss of promise, of commitment, of two souls finally finding their way to each other. When they parted, the sun had disappeared below the horizon, and the room was filled with the soft glow of twilight. "There is one more thing," Dante said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Elena's heart stopped as he opened it to reveal a ring, a simple band of white gold with a single perfect diamond. "I bought this 3 months after we were married," he said. "I have been waiting for the right moment to give it to you. A moment when our marriage was real, not just a transaction. A moment when I could stand before you as the man I truly am, not the man I pretended to be." He took her hand and slipped the ring onto her finger. "Elena Marchetti Romano, will you marry me? Not because you have to, but because you want to. Not out of obligation, but out of love." Elena looked at the ring on her finger, at the man standing before her, at the life they had built together, through pain and fear and hope. "Yes," she whispered, 1,000 times yes. Dante pulled her into his arms again, and she knew with absolute certainty that this was the beginning of something beautiful. The weeks that followed the courtroom revelation were unlike anything Eleanor had experienced. The world that had once seemed so hostile and judgmental transformed into something entirely different. Letters arrived by the hundreds from people across the country who had been touched by the truth about Dante's secret philanthropy. Children who had received scholarships wrote to thank the anonymous benefactor who had changed their lives. Families who had found shelter in the clinics he funded sent photographs and stories of hope renewed. Doctors and nurses who worked in the hospitals he supported shared testimonies of the lives saved by his generosity. Eleanor read every letter, every message, every testimony, and with each one, she saw Dante change a little more. The walls he had built around himself continued to crumble, brick by brick, revealing the man she had always known was hiding beneath. But not everyone celebrated the revelation. There were those who saw Dante's transformation as a threat, who preferred the old order where power was measured in fear and violence was the only currency that mattered. Victor Castellano was one of them. Elena had heard the name whispered in the corridors of the estate, spoken with a mixture of respect and apprehension by Dante's men. Victor was old guard, a man who had risen through the ranks alongside Dante's father, and who had never accepted the changes that the younger Romano had begun to implement. He was also, Elena would soon learn, far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The confrontation came on a Thursday evening when autumn had painted the gardens in shades of gold and crimson. Elena was in the conservatory, reviewing plans for a new charitable foundation she and Dante were establishing, when Marco appeared in the doorway with a grim expression. "Mrs. Romano," he said, his voice tight, "we have a situation." Elena set down her papers and rose to her feet. "What kind of situation? Victor Castellano is here. He has demanded a meeting with Mr. Romano. And where is my husband?" Marco hesitated. "He is in his office. He asked me to keep you here, away from the meeting." Elena felt a cold fury settle in her chest. She had spent 3 years being protected, sheltered, kept away from the darker aspects of her husband's world. She understood why Dante did it. She knew he loved her and wanted to shield her from danger. But she was no longer the frightened girl who had walked down the aisle with fear in her heart. She was his partner, his equal, and she would not be left behind. "Take me to him," she said. Marco looked like he wanted to argue, but something in her expression stopped him. He nodded slowly and led her through the estate to Dante's office. The office was a large room dominated by a massive mahogany desk and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the front drive. When Elena entered, she found Dante standing behind his desk, his posture rigid with tension. Across from him, seated in a leather armchair with the casual arrogance of a man who believed himself untouchable, was Victor Castellano. Victor was in his 60s, with silver hair swept back from a face that might have been handsome once, but had been hardened by decades of cruelty. His eyes were cold and calculating, and they turned to Elena with undisguised contempt as she entered. "Ah," he said, his voice dripping with mock courtesy. "The famous Mrs. Romano, the woman who has turned our fearsome leader into a charity case." Dante's jaw tightened. "Victor, I will ask you once to speak to my wife with respect." Victor laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the walls. "Respect? I remember when that word meant something in our world. I remember when a Romano commanded fear, not sympathy. Your father would be ashamed to see what you have become." Elena crossed the room and stood beside her husband. She could feel the tension radiating from him, the barely contained anger that threatened to break free. "My father," Dante said through gritted teeth, "is dead, and his ways died with him." Victor rose from his chair, his movements slow and deliberate. "That is where you are wrong," he said. "The old ways never die. They simply wait for someone strong enough to restore them, and I have been waiting a long time." He reached into his jacket, and for a terrible moment, Eleanor thought he was going for a weapon. But instead, he pulled out a folded piece of paper and tossed it onto Dante's desk. "I have gathered support," Victor continued. "Enough of our associates agree that your recent revelations have weakened our position. They have asked me to deliver a message." Dante picked up the paper and unfolded it. His expression remained unchanged as he read, but Elena saw his knuckles whiten where he gripped the edge of the desk. "They want me to step down," Dante said flatly. "They want order restored," Victor replied. "They want a leader who remembers what we are. Not a philanthropist, not a reformer, a boss, a real boss." Eleanor felt her heart pounding against her ribs, but she forced herself to remain calm. She stepped forward, drawing Victor's attention. "May I see that?" she asked, gesturing to the paper. Victor raised an eyebrow but nodded with a smirk. "Of course, Mrs. Romano. Perhaps you can convince your husband to see reason." Elena took the paper from Dante's hands and read it carefully. It was a list of signatures, names she recognized from the file she had studied over the years. Men who controlled territories, operations, resources, men who had pledged loyalty to the Romano family for generations. But as she read, She noticed something. Several of the signatures were shaky, uncertain. Others were placed at odd angles, as if written under duress, and a few names were conspicuously absent, men she knew were fiercely loyal to Dante. She looked up at Victor with a calm smile. "This is impressive," she said. "You have clearly worked hard to gather this support." Victor's smirk widened. "Indeed I have." Elena handed the paper back to Dante. "But I noticed some things missing. Roberto Genovese, for instance, and Marco Valenti, and the entire Chicago operation." Victor's smile faltered slightly. "They will come around." "Will they?" Elena tilted her head. "Or have they already made their choice? You see, Mr. Castellano, I may be new to this world, but I have learned a few things over the past 3 years. I have learned that loyalty is not given, it is earned, and I have learned that fear is a poor substitute for respect." She stepped closer to Victor, her eyes locked on his. "My husband has spent his entire life building something, not just an empire of power, but a legacy of purpose. The men who follow him do so not because they are afraid of what he might do, but because they believe in what he is trying to become. Can you say the same?" Victor's face reddened. "You know nothing of our world. You are nothing but a debt marker, a woman bought and paid for." Dante moved so fast that Elena barely saw it. One moment he was standing behind his desk. The next, he had Victor by the throat, pressed against the wall. "You will never speak to my wife that way again," Dante said, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of absolute authority. "You will never look at her with disrespect. You will never even think her name without remembering this moment." Victor's eyes bulged, his hands clawing uselessly at Dante's grip. "Do you understand?" Dante asked. Victor managed a strangled nod. Dante released him, and Victor crumpled to the floor, gasping for breath. Dante straightened his jacket and looked down at the older man with cold contempt. "Take your list and leave my home," Dante said. "Tell your supporters that Dante Romano is not going anywhere, and tell them that the next person who threatens my wife will not receive a warning." Victor scrambled to his feet, his face a mask of humiliation and fury. He grabbed the paper from the desk and headed for the door, but stopped at the threshold. "This is not over," he spat. Elena stepped forward. "Actually, Mr. Castellano, I believe it is. You see, while you were gathering signatures from men who are afraid of change, I was having conversations with their wives, their daughters, their mothers, the women who actually run your households and manage your books and know where all the skeletons are buried." She smiled. "Sweetly. You might want to ask them how they feel about your little coup before you proceed." Victor stared at her for a long moment, his face cycling through emotions too rapidly to track. Then, without another word, he turned and left. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Elena's heart pounding in her ears. Dante turned to her, his expression a mixture of pride and exasperation. "You did what?" he asked. Elena shrugged. "I made some phone calls, had some lunches. Women talk. Dante, we share information, and I may have mentioned how different things might be under a more progressive leadership." He stared at her. "You have been planning this. I told you. I learned from the best." He laughed then, a genuine sound of delight and disbelief. He pulled her into his arms and held her close. "Elena Romano, you are absolutely terrifying." "I know," she said, "and you love me for it. I do. God help me, I do. If this moment moved you, if you felt the tension, the fear, the triumph, then do something for me. Leave a comment right now that says, 'I believe in second chances,' because that is what this story is about. It is about the power of love to transform even the darkest hearts. Leave that comment and let me know you are here with me on this journey." The months that followed Victor's failed coup brought changes that Elena had hardly dared to imagine. The network that had once operated in shadows began to emerge into the light. Legitimate businesses flourished. The charitable foundation grew beyond anything Elena had envisioned, funding schools and hospitals and community centers across the country. Dante transformed before her eyes. The man who had once hidden behind a mask of cold authority became someone more open, more present, more alive. He laughed more often. He slept through the night without the nightmares that had once plagued him. He looked at Eleanor with an expression that made her heart swell every time she caught it. But perhaps the greatest change came in the form of a child. Her name was Sophia, and she arrived on a rainy November evening when the world seemed determined to wash itself clean. Elena had found her huddled in a doorway during a visit to one of the Foundation's shelters, a tiny girl with enormous dark eyes and a spirit that refused to be broken. Sophia's story was one that Elena recognized all too well. A mother lost to illness, a father who had disappeared, a system that had failed her at every turn. She was 8 years old and had already learned that the world was a dangerous place where no one could be trusted. But she had not yet learned that miracles were possible. Elena had knelt beside her in that doorway, rain soaking through her expensive coat, and had seen something in those dark eyes that called to her soul. "Would you like to come home with me?" Elena had asked. Sophia had studied her for a long moment, her small face serious and guarded. "Why?" the girl had asked. "No one wants me." Elena had felt, tears mixing with the rain on her cheeks. "I want you," she had said, "and so does my husband. We have a very big house with a very big garden, and we have been waiting for someone exactly like you." Sophia had considered this. "Do you have a dog?" Eleanor had smiled through her tears. "Not yet, but I think we could get one." And that had been the beginning. The adoption process was complicated by Dante's history, but Eleanor had prepared for that. She had gathered documentation of his charitable work, testimonials from community leaders, reports from the Foundation. She had built a case so airtight that even the most skeptical judge had been forced to acknowledge that Dante Romano was not the man his reputation suggested. The day the adoption was finalized, Dante had broken down and wept for the first time since Elena had known him. He had held Sophia in his arms and promised her that she would never be alone again, that she would always be safe, that she would always be loved. And Sophia, who had learned to trust no one, had wrapped her small arms around his neck and whispered, "I know, Papa. I know." Now, 6 months later, Elena stood at the window of the conservatory and watched Dante playing with Sophia in the garden below. They were building something out of leaves and sticks, a project that seemed to involve a great deal of laughter and not much actual construction. Their golden retriever, a ridiculous beast named Leonardo that Sophia had chosen herself, bounded around them in circles of pure joy. Elena placed her hand on her stomach and smiled. She had not told Dante yet. She was waiting for the right moment, though every moment with him felt right these days. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. In the distance, she could see the lights of the city flickering to life. But here, in this garden, in this moment, there was only peace. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Marco standing in the doorway. His expression was different these days too, softer somehow, though he would never admit it. "Mrs. Romano," he said, "your guests have arrived." Elena nodded. "Please show them to the living room. I will be there shortly." She took one last look at the scene in the garden, committing it to memory. Then she turned and walked through the house that had once felt like a prison, but now felt like home. The living room was filled with women. They sat on the sofas and chairs that Elena had carefully arranged, their faces a mixture of curiosity and hope. These were the wives and daughters and mothers of the men who had once followed Victor Castellano. They had come because Elena had invited them. They had stayed because they had found something they had not expected. Community. Elena had started these gatherings 6 months ago, informal meetings where the women could talk about their lives, their fears, their dreams. What had begun as a strategic move had become something genuine, a network of support and friendship that crossed the boundaries of territory and allegiance. "Ladies," Elena said as she took her place among them, "thank you for coming. I know many of you have traveled far to be here." A woman named Rosa, whose husband controlled operations in Boston, leaned forward. "We would not miss it," she said. "These meetings have changed everything for us. For the first time, we feel like we are part of something real." Eleanor smiled. "That is what I wanted to talk to you about today. Dante and I have been discussing the future, and we have a proposal. She looked around the room, meeting each woman's eyes in turn. For too long, our families have operated in the shadows. We have hidden our power, our resources, our influence. But the world is changing, and we have an opportunity to change with it. She gestured to the folder on the table before her. We are establishing a new program, a scholarship fund for the children of our community, a network of support for families in need, a foundation that will operate openly, transparently, with the full backing of every family represented in this room. The women exchanged glances, some surprised, some skeptical, some already nodding in agreement. This is not just about charity, Elena continued. This is about legacy. It is about showing the world that we are more than the stories told about us. It is about building something that our children and grandchildren can be proud of. Rosa spoke again. And what about the men? What will they say? Elena smiled. The men will follow, they always do eventually. But change does not start with them. It starts with us. It starts in the homes we build, the children we raise, the values we teach. It starts right here, in this room. The silence stretched for a moment, and then a woman named Lucia, whose family had been with the organization for 4 generations, rose to her feet. I am in, she said simply. One by one, the others followed. Voices called out their support. Hands reached across the circle to clasp each other. By the time the sun had fully set, every woman in the room had committed to the vision Elena had laid out. As the guests began to leave, Rosa pulled Elena aside. You have done something remarkable, she said. Not just for us, for all of us. I never thought I would see the day when our world could change like this. Elena squeezed her hand. It is only the beginning, she said. There is so much more to do. Rosa nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. And you will not do it alone? None of us will. After the last guest had gone, Elena found Dante waiting for her in the hallway. Sophia was already asleep upstairs, exhausted from her adventures in the garden. Leonardo lay at Dante's feet, tail thumping lazily against the marble floor. How did it go? Dante asked. Elena walked into his arms and rested her head against his chest. Better than I hoped, she said. They are all with us. Dante kissed the top of her head. I never doubted it. You are the most persuasive person I have ever met. Elena pulled back and looked up at him. I have something to tell you. She took his hand and placed it on her stomach. We are going to have a baby. The expression that crossed Dante's face was one Elena would remember for the rest of her life. It was wonder, joy, fear, and hope, all mingled together in a way that made him look impossibly young and impossibly old at the same time. A baby, he whispered. A baby. He pulled her close again, and she could feel him trembling. I never thought I would have this, he said, his voice rough with emotion. A family, a real family. Children who will grow up in the light instead of the shadows. Eleanor smiled against his chest. They will know nothing of the old world. They will know only love and safety and possibility. Because of you, Dante said. Everything good in my life is because of you. They stood there in the hallway as the night deepened around them. 2 people who had found each other against all odds, who had built something, beautiful from the ruins of a broken world. And somewhere above them, in a room filled with stuffed animals and dreams of golden retrievers, a little girl slept peacefully, knowing for the first time in her short life that she was exactly where she belonged. 3 years had passed since the day Elena stood in that courtroom and changed everything. 3 years of transformation, of growth, of becoming the people they had always been meant to be. The estate had changed too. The cold formality that had once defined it had been replaced by warmth and laughter. Sophia's artwork covered the refrigerator in the kitchen. Leonardo's toys were scattered across floors that had once been pristine. The sounds of children playing filled rooms that had once known only silence and secrets. And now, on a perfect September afternoon, the gardens were filled with guests, celebrating something Elena had never thought she would see. The wedding of Marco and his longtime partner, a woman named Isabella, who had been with him through everything. Dante had insisted on hosting the ceremony, on giving Marco the celebration he deserved. It was a gift that said more about how far they had all come than any words could express. Elena stood at the edge of the gathering, watching the ceremony unfold. Sophia stood beside her, now 11 years old, and every bit as fierce and tender as the day Elena had found her. In Elena's arms was their son, a 2-year-old tornado named Alessandro, who had his father's grey eyes and his mother's stubborn spirit. The vows were beautiful, simple promises spoken between two people who had weathered storms together and emerged stronger for it. When Marco kissed his bride, the guests erupted in cheers that echoed across the hills. Dante appeared at Elena's side, slipping his arm around her waist. "Do you remember our wedding?" he asked. Elena laughed. "I remember being terrified. And now I cannot imagine my life any other way." They watched as the celebration continued, as friends and family danced and laughed and toasted to the future. The network that had once operated through fear now functioned through loyalty and shared purpose. The foundation Elena had established had grown into something remarkable, touching lives across the country and beyond. But perhaps the greatest transformation was the one that could not be seen, the one that had taken place in hearts and minds and spirits. Dante was no longer the man the world had feared. He was a father who read bedtime stories with different voices for every character. He was a husband who still brought Elena terrible coffee every morning and who held her hand through every challenge and triumph. He was a leader who inspired not through intimidation, but through example. And Elena was no longer the frightened girl who had traded herself for her family's survival. She was a force of nature in her own right, a woman who had reshaped an empire through compassion and intelligence, and an absolutely stubborn refusal to accept that things could not change. As the sun began to set over the garden, painting everything in shades of gold and rose, Sophia tugged at Elena's hand. "Mama," she said, "can I ask you something?" "Of course, sweetheart." Sophia bit her lip, a gesture she had picked up from Elena herself. "Why do people still whisper about Papa sometimes? I heard some kids at school saying things, scary things." Elena knelt down so she was at eye level with her daughter. "People whisper because they do not understand," she said gently. "They remember the stories from before when Papa was trying to be someone he was not. But those stories are not the whole truth. They are just one chapter in a very long book." Sophia considered this. "So people can change. Like, really change." Elena smiled and brushed a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "Yes, my love. People can change. It takes courage and hard work, and sometimes it takes someone who believes in you when you cannot believe in yourself. But change is always possible." Sophia nodded slowly. "I think I understand." She looked over at Dante, who was laughing at something Marco had said. "Papa seems happy." "He is happy. We all are." Sophia hugged her mother tightly. "I am glad you found us. Me and Papa." Elena held her close, tears pricking at her eyes. "I am glad too," she whispered. "More than you will ever know." The celebration continued long into the evening. Lanterns were lit along the garden paths, casting soft golden light over the dancers, and dreamers gathered there. Music floated through the air, mixing with laughter and conversation. As Elena danced with Dante under the stars, she thought about the journey that had brought them here, the fear and the hope, the pain and the healing, the moment in that courtroom when she had taken the greatest risk of her life. "What are you thinking about?" Dante asked. "Everything," she said. "Nothing. Just how lucky we are." He pulled her closer. "Luck had nothing to do with it. You made this happen. You believed in something no one else could see. I believed in you." He kissed her forehead. "And I will spend the rest of my life being worthy of that belief." They swayed together as the music played on, two people who had found each other in the darkness and had chosen to walk toward the light together. In the distance, Sophia chased Alessandro across the lawn, Leonardo bounding alongside them in a blur of golden fur. Marco and Isabella danced nearby, lost in their own world. The guests laughed and talked and celebrated a future that seemed brighter than anyone had dared to imagine. And Elena knew with a certainty that filled her entire being that this was just the beginning. The years continued to pass, each one bringing new challenges and new joys. Alessandro grew into a thoughtful young man with his mother's compassion and his father's quiet strength. Sofia graduated from law school, determined to use her education to help families like the one she had lost and the one she had found. The foundation expanded its reach, touching millions of lives and proving that even the darkest origins could lead to the brightest futures. Dante and Elena grew older together, their love deepening with each passing season. The grey in his hair only made him more distinguished. The lines around her eyes only made her smile more beautiful. They had built something together that neither of them had thought possible, a life of purpose and meaning and joy. On the evening of their 20th anniversary, Elena stood at the window of their bedroom and looked out at the grounds below. The gardens had matured over the years, the young trees she had planted now tall and strong. The children were grown now, making their own way in the world, but they still came home for holidays and celebrations, filling the old house with the laughter of the next generation. Dante appeared beside her, slipping his arms around her waist. 20 years, he said softly. Can you believe it? Elena leaned back, against him. Some days it feels like a lifetime, other days it feels like we just met. He turned her to face him, his storm-grey eyes still capable of making her heart race after all these years. Thank you, he said. For what? For everything. For believing in me when I did not believe in myself. For standing beside me through every storm. For giving me a life I never thought I deserved. Elena reached up and touched his face. You deserve every happiness, Dante Romano. You always did. You just needed someone to remind you. He kissed her then, a kiss that held 2 decades of love and struggle and triumph. When they parted, Elena smiled. There is something I want to show you. She led him through the house, past the photographs that documented their journey, past the rooms where their children had played and grown, past the memories that filled every corner. They emerged onto the terrace that overlooked the valley below. The sun was setting, painting the sky in the same shades of gold and rose that had colored so many of their most precious moments. Look, Elena said, pointing toward the horizon. A new building rose in the distance, its modern architecture gleaming in the fading light. It was the newest addition to the foundation, a center for families in crisis that would provide shelter, support, and hope to those who needed it most. It opens next month, Elena said. I wanted you to see it before the ceremony. Dante stared at the building for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. You built that, we built that, all of us together. He shook his head in wonder. 20 years ago, I was a man drowning in darkness. I thought power was the only thing that mattered. I thought love was a weakness. I thought my only legacy would be fear. He turned to face her. And now look at what we have created. Look at what you made possible. Elena took his hands in hers. This is what happens when you let love lead, she said. This is what happens when you choose light over shadow, compassion over cruelty, hope over despair. The sun continued to set as they stood together on the terrace, 2 people who had walked through fire and emerged not just unburned, but transformed. Behind them, the house glowed with warmth and welcome. Before them, the future stretched out like an endless possibility. I love you. Elena Marchetti Romano, Dante said. From the moment I first saw you to this moment and every moment beyond. And I love you, Dante Romano. I always have. I always will. They embraced as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, standing at the center of the life they had built, the family they had created, the legacy they would leave behind. And somewhere in the vast universe, perhaps there was a force that noticed 2 small souls who had defied every expectation, who had rewritten their own story, who had proven that even in the darkest corners of the world, love could still find a way to bloom. The divorce request had looked like weakness, but the crowd had learned who the Mafia boss really was, and what they had learned changed everything. If you have watched this far, it is because this story touched your heart. It means you believe in the power of love to transform even the darkest souls. Leave a comment right now that says, "I watched this far, so I can get to know you and see who really enjoys the stories here on this channel." And while you are here, hit that subscribe button if you have not already. Give this video a like to help more people find these stories, and share it with someone who needs to believe that second chances are possible. Because they are. They always are. Thank you for being here. Thank you for believing. And thank you for being part of this journey. Until next time.